Chapter II of Dress Design, an account of costume for artists and dressmakers, by Talbot Hughes. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Dress Design, an account of costume for artists and dressmakers, by Talbot Hughes. Chapter II. Part I. The development of costume to the 10th century. Female. The female headdress consisted chiefly of flowing hair banded with a circlet of various shapes, but a development of braiding plaits is found very early, and the hair was probably arranged so before the Roman era. These plaits were generally brought over the shoulder to the front, the hair being parted in the centre, thus making an oval forehead. Various caps began to show originality, and jewels were set in the centre of the forehead on the little crown-like hat, which must have been most becoming. Squares of coloured stuffs were draped over the head and shoulders, sometimes upon white linen squares, and many ladies began to bind the face and head, shutting out the hair, in the 8th century. The kerchief draping is very important to study, because it was the general mode amongst the people. Heavy collars of ornament and strings of beads hanging even to the waist are noticeable features of these centuries, also large earrings. A full cloak with a large clasp or brooch opened in front, or was turned to free one shoulder. There was also a long drape thrown round over the opposite shoulder or brought picturesquely over the head. The ecclesiastical form of cloak, as described in the male attire, was also formed about the 6th century. Its graceful line was frequently bordered completely with a band of ornament, and it was clasped just across the breasts. The complete circular cloak, with a hole for the head, is seen very early, decorated with a pinked edge, which may also be noted on some of the short dresses of the middle classes. Aprons are no doubt of the earliest origin. A loose tunic falling to the hips was girded rather high up the body, as in the classic dress, and bands passing both outside or crossing between the breasts and going over the shoulder came from the same source. These were with or without short sleeves to the elbow. A long loose robe was the chief attire to the 6th century, belted rather high in the waist and caught up with a girdle at the hips. These girdles gave a great interest to the early centuries with the art of arranging the fullness of the skirt into its hold. From the 6th century the dress became closer fitting, and a short bodice is seen. The neck was cut very low, either square or round in shape, and this style had short, tight sleeves, or tight sleeves to the wrists. The later tunic of the 9th century marked the beginning of the slit-open upper sleeve, and a greater length of the neck opening, which came to be fastened down in front of the waist. The early skirts, to the 6th century, were hung from the hips, and were often attached to a heavy girdle band. The fullness was gathered mostly at the back and front. Other skirts hung from a higher belt, and were again caught up in the girdle. A V-shaped neck setting was worn by the Franks, from which probably came the shaped front piece which will interest us in the 13th century. The shoes were similar to the male shapes described later, and the same mode of binding the stockings was sometimes imitated. Part II. The development of costume to the 10th century. Male. In taking the long period from the Roman occupation to the 10th century, we can discover a real development of style in costume, as with the system of vassalage a distinction of class arose. No doubt the Romans introduced a finer tuition of weaving, needlecraft, decoration, and dyeing, and later the various peoples coming from the continent, when settled under Alfred in the 9th century, produced a solid style of barbaric splendour. The male hair-dressing from the rugged mass of hair soon became well combed and trimmed square across the neck. Earrings may still have been used by some nobles till the 11th century, and chaplets were worn upon the hair. The Saxon beard was divided into 2 points. Small round tight caps of wool, fur, or velvet, and rush or straw hats of a definite shape were in use to the 10th century. Tight caps with lappets tied under the chin and hoods appear on the short capes about the 8th century, or probably earlier. The garment was of the simplest form, cut like a plain square loose shirt to the middle of the thigh, and this was put over the head. The opening to pass the head through was the first part to receive a band of decoration. The sides were sometimes open to the hips, and the front caught between the legs and held at the waist. A garment opened down the front, and another wrapped across to either shoulder, as is seen. A belt girt the waist, and the tunic was pulled loosely over it. This also carried the essential requirements in the shape of a pouch, dagger, knife, comb, sword, etc. The neck was ornamented with chains of bronze, gold, beads, and charms, and up to the 8th century a bronze ornamental armlet was worn, besides a wristlet. The men of the ruling class from the 8th century were clothed in a long garment of simple shape, falling to the ankle, richly broidered at the hem and neck. This generally had long tight sleeves, and often over this a shorter tunic, reaching just below the knee, sometimes sleeveless, or with rather full sleeves tightening to the wrist. A plain, square, chasuble shape was in fashion from the 8th century, reaching to the bottom of the calf of the leg, and richer materials began to be used. No belt was passed round this, as it was allowed to fall straight. Loose breeches were worn from very early times, and a loose trouser to the ankle, being tied there or bound crosswise from the boots, sometimes right up the thigh. The same binding was done even with the bare legs, and later hose. Close-fitting, short breeches and cloth hose became a feature in the 10th century, and with the latter an ornamental knee-piece or garter below the knee sometimes finished the strappings. The cloak was the grand garment, heavily banded with ornament and fastened with a large clasp on one shoulder, or at the centre of the breast. Long circular cloaks of varying lengths, put on over the head, were much favoured, and when caught up at the sides on either shoulder gave a fine draped effect. Another cloak of ecclesiastical character, sloping in a curve from the neck and not meeting in front, is seen on many notable figures from the early 8th century, large clasps bridging the width low down on the chest. No doubt the sandal of various forms was much used for footwear throughout this period, also a simple low shoe which was held on by the leg strappings, as about the 8th century, shoes are seen with loops at the upper edge, these being attachments for the binding, and this was no doubt a method from the prehistoric times. There was also a soft boot reaching to the calf, laced up the front, and after the 8th century a rather pointed shoe, opened down the instep, laced, tied, or gathered into a buckle about the ankle. End of chapter 2. Chapter 3 of Dress Design. An Account of Costume for Artists and Dressmakers, by Talbot Hughes. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Libby Gone. Dress Design. An Account of Costume for Artists and Dressmakers, by Talbot Hughes. Chapter 3. Part 1. 10th to the 15th century. Female. The headdress of women now began to show a preference to confine the hair with nets, and to close in the face, which continued till the 15th century. The circlet and long plait or plaits and the flowing hair remained till the 14th century. In the 12th century we discover the hair gathered in nets at either side of the head, and covering the ears. A low-crowned hat was bound over with a band of lawn or fine material passing underneath the chin, otherwise the plaits were looped up under a circlet which was also worn with the flowing hair. A square effect was aimed at in the 13th century, with tight side plaits bound into a shape, or netted hair was strapped to the head, as in Fig. 11. A fall of fine material softened the hard effect, and many ladies of quality bound the face, neck, and head in the wimple of fine linen, sometimes gathering this to the same quaint shape of the netted hair. I give a variety of these settings on page 65. A kerchief of linen coming round the neck was brought up tightly round the face and festooned on top of the head, while another piece was pinned close to the brows and fell loosely to the shoulders, being often held on by a circlet as well. This character was maintained till the early 14th century, when a style of high-peaked hats came into evidence, one shape of which became the most imposing feature of historic costume in the 15th century. It was still but a simple form in the middle of the 14th century, for another shape first gained predominance. Early in this century also may be noted a curious shape like the cap of Liberty, usually with a long tail at the back as drawn on page 59. This carried design to the eccentric forms of the pig-tailed hood, and then the rival of the high-peaked hat took its place towards the end of the 14th century. A cushioned headdress, which rose and divided in a horn-like structure. It started, as in Fig. 25, and I have illustrated its progress. The veil draping was a great feature, giving plenty of scope for individual fancy. It was, as a rule, richly decorated with gold and jewels, and the hair was completely enclosed in a gold net and a tight-fitting cap to hold this erection. Long drop earrings were much worn, and a fine chain of gems encircled the neck or fell to the breast. In the 10th century a long close-fitting robe was in fashion, sometimes with a deep V-shaped neck opening, though usually the neck was cut to a round form. Some sleeves were tighter with a small cuff, but usually the outer garment had a falling sleeve with a square or rounded end showing the tight undersleeve. The outer sleeve varied much in length, from the elbow or hands dropping even to the ground. It was narrow and had widened through the 14th century, when its edge was cut into various patterns as in Fig. 18. In the 13th century we notice a long sleeve opened at the elbow for the undersleeve to come through, which beautiful style continued to the middle of the 17th century. With the 10th century came the first corselet from the waist to the hip, clasping a loose tunic with an underdress taking a long pointed train. The manner of tucking the tunic under the corselet when it was worn over it, and so creating festoons, is worthy of noticing as interesting in arrangement and design. The 13th century parti-coloured and striped dresses foreshadowed the heraldic fashion, which must be studied for its proportion and treatment of decorative colour values in counterchange to get the true value of its noble effects. A great feature now appears in the chasuble shaped front, or setting to a close-cut jacket. This ultimately becomes the decorative stomacher through the later periods, and it is very interesting to note its development. In the 13th century this jacket was a fur construction of a long, simple form, opened at the sides to the hips for the sleeves to come through. It had a straight hem or was rounded at the front points, and the chasuble form of it was treated as in Fig. 13, or in conjunction with a short cape. It was chiefly a decoration of ermine. It grew into a complete jacket, and in the 14th century it was heavily ornamented with gems, and the simple front, from being a feature outside the jacket, was later often enclosed at the sides. The jacket itself is beautiful in form and proportion, and the curved bands of design over the hips makes a nice foil to the curved front. This pattern is plainly derived from the effect of the rich girdle that was first seen through the side openings, and a few jackets are without it. The usual shaping of the neck with most of these was square. In the first quarter of the 14th century the setting of the neck was of a round shape, and after 1350 a raised or curved form is favoured. Later still, and with the horn-like headdress, a very deep V shape, open almost to the belt, was the mode, often being filled in with velvet. At the same time some began to take up the fashions of a very high collar and a round-shaped body and sleeves, as in Fig. 24, with which a wide pointed belt is seen. Some robes were opened in the front up to the height of the girdle, though many dresses were worn without girdles after the 12th century. Decorated pockets are sometimes seen in the later period, and an interesting hand covering or falling cuff came with them. The cloak, as described in the 10th century, still continued to the 12th, as well as the light wrap, which may almost be placed with any period, though mostly a feature of the more classic styles. Skirts and underskirts were worn with trains. They were mostly banded with wide borders of ornament up to the 13th century, the fullness being often gathered to the back and front. The chasuble-shaped overdress was worn to the middle of the 14th century, sleeveless, and laced or sewn tight to the figure from the arm to the hip, or completely down the sides, generally reached just below the knee. The shoes were of much the same character as those of the male examples illustrated, though they hardly reached the same extravagance in length, owing no doubt to the feet of woman being hampered by her skirt, but I suspect they even braved high wooden clogs, as we know they did the tall chopins of the 16th century, to heighten their stature. Part II. 10th to the 15th century. Male. From the 10th to the 15th century we find costume developing rapidly into elaborate and interesting designs. Close relations with the continent brought new ideas, and rich velvets and brocades interwoven with gold enhanced the gorgeousness of attire, while the introduction of heraldic design brought in a very picturesque element. Hats and headdresses began to become important features, enlarging to eccentric shapes and proportions, only equalled in the extravagant part of the 18th century. It may be noted that feminine fashion, as it assumes new characters and proportions, affects the style of the male clothes in the same way, as when a high or pointed headdress comes in, the male hat also increases its size, the same with curved or angular designs, full or tight sleeves. The hair was worn long and rather squared in shape at the back till the end of the 15th century. A tendency to shut in the face by close hoods tied under the chin is remarked, and this forms a strong feature of the 13th and 14th centuries. Earrings were seldom worn after the 10th century, but the neck was generally adorned with heavy chain decorations. Beards assumed a pointed shape in accordance with this development of fashion, and double-pointed beards were revived between 1380 and 1386. Hats of straw with mushroom brims and round tops came into vogue in the 11th century, covered with coloured materials and finished with a spike or button at the top, and the crowns of these took a pointed shape in the 14th century. The usual cap with folded brim had a loose crown, and we found this begin to lengthen and fall over to one side in the 11th century, and continued to elongate till in the 15th century it often dropped to the knee in a long thin point. In the 14th century it took a fullness of loose folds, with serrated or foliated edges falling to the shoulder, as in Fig. 15. A close helmet-shaped cap is seen in the 12th century, with a falling point from the crown, and the 13th century brought in the higher crowned hat, with a long peaked front, turned up at the back. Feathers were worn at the front, back, or side of hats, and sometimes on the front of hoods. These increased their dimensions in height and peak till the straight-up high hat, which was often brimless, came in the 15th century. The early hood or cowl soon began to vary its designs, for in the 13th century it was often a part of or attached to a chasuble shape falling back and front, or with a long front, stopping at a short cape length behind. A note of interest in the 14th century appears, where the forehead part of the hood is turned up, showing a coloured lining, and at times the fashionable serrated edge surrounding the face is seen. The chasuble-shaped garment was a feature often worn over the coat until the end of the 15th century, and was generally worn long, with the elongated fashion of the 14th century, and short with the shorter tunics of the 15th century. They are found very wide in the 14th century, and so fall down over the shoulder, where they are often laced a short distance up, creating an interesting feature. Cloaks were not so much in favour with the heavier cowl and cape, but they were used, fastened by brooches to either shoulder rather than at the back, after the 12th century. A very tight-fitting suit called justacorps came into use from the 12th century, and developed a padded, round-shaped body towards the end of the 14th century. The closely cut body was buttoned up to the throat, or was set with a high collar for the first time. The tights came over it, sometimes rather high up to the waist, being laced to it. A long tunic was chiefly favoured during the 10th and 11th centuries, with short or long cuffless sleeves, and a full bell-shaped falling sleeve showed the close-fitting under one. These tunics were chiefly open at the neck as in the earlier times, though a slight difference to be noted is a V-shaped opening in the 14th century, which is developed in the 15th century. They were also split at the sides, even to the hips. Some were very full in shape, and were gathered to either side as in the illustration. Others had the body closely fitted and full only in the skirt, but as a rule one finds this latter shape only reaches just below the knee. They were often tucked into the belt in front, showing a rich underskirt. The girdle, besides a belt, was worn over the hips with the longer tunics, as in Fig. 28, the dagger and pouch being carried in front on the girdle, and not the belt. A small dagger was often slung at the back or front of the neck as an ornament at the end of the 14th century. Tights to the waist were worn with both long and short tunics, and retained the crossed bindings up the legs to the 13th century, in the various designs of page 53. Parti-coloured tights came in with the 14th century, carrying out the heraldic character of dress, and this may be found till about 1530. A sandal shoe was much worn up to the 12th century, with strappings to various heights up the leg, this even over the short top boots, but the usual shoe opened down the front of the instep to the toe, which was rather pointed in shape, and it was curved or square at the ankle. The illustration gives a good variety of the prevalent forms. The stocking boot is also another characteristic of this earlier time, as well as the commoner's woollen gaiters, worn as in Fig. 30, on the seated figure, which were used to the middle of the 16th century. In the illustrations which show no shoe on the tights, it will be understood that a sole of leather was sewn on to the under part of the foot. This practice is even seen to-day on the Continent, where the clog is mostly in use. A soft boot, reaching to the calf, was worn till the 15th century, with the top folded or trimmed with fur, the latter being generally laced down the front, even to the instep. The shape of these only varied in the length of the pointed toes as the style developed. The long pointed shoes began to increase all through the 13th century, and in the 14th century they reached their greatest length, when the points were often tied up to a garter just below the knee. Wooden clogs were much used, and were often considerably raised. Iron circular supports were also in use at the end of this time. These were the foretaste of the eccentric Chopin of the 16th century, which were more favoured on the continent than here. The pointed toes were also made to curl outwards, giving a splay-footed effect late in the 14th century. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4 of Dress Design, an account of costume for artists and dressmakers by Talbot Hughes. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Libby Gone. Dress Design, an account of costume for artists and dressmakers by Talbot Hughes. Chapter 4, Part 1, 15th Century, Female. We have now arrived at the height of eccentric fashion in medieval headdress. The horn-like creations, studded with jewels, and peaks of wondrous height, both draped with fine muslins, and often completely shutting away the hair from sight, had a supporting cap, which mostly came over the ears and cheeks, and a clutch is seen on the forehead, at times concealed by a jewel. The hair was generally allowed to fall loose under the back drape, or a long plait is sometimes seen at the back with the first named headdress. The back drape setting from the brow down the back was well conceived to balance the high spire, but it seems to have been discarded during the reign of Edward V, and light veil falls were worn, which often came half over the face. In Henry VII's time, the extreme fashion came into the shape of a closely fitting curved cap, with a fall of material over the back. The ermine-trimmed jacket was still in favour to the middle of the last named reign, when it was worn low down over the hips. The chief dress of this period had a V-shaped collar front meeting at the waist, mostly made in black material or fur. It was wide on the shoulder, and seems to have been stiffened to set out. The V-shape was generally filled in with velvet, and a very wide band encircled the waist. A girdle is occasionally noted. The keys pocket and other requisites were generally carried on the underskirt during these times. The skirt was full and gathered to the back in a train, the gathers often running into the bodice. A very wide border is prevalent, even to the middle of the thigh. Tight sleeves are usual, and hanging sleeves were worn, mostly set in a very short sleeve, which assume a puff shape in Henry VII's reign. Long cuffs, almost covering the head, are seen on many sleeves. Modes of opening the skirt up to the hips occasionally showed themselves, and even the sides to the hips are seen laced. In the earlier dress, about 1485, the neck setting of dress became very square, and was filled with fine drawn lawn. The square shape rises in a curved centre before the end of this period, and a close-fitting robe was worn with a girdle, often opened up the sides. The short upper sleeve and full outer sleeve, so much in vogue, gave place to a divided upper and lower sleeve, laced or tied with ribbon, with puffs of lawn pulled through the opening at the shoulder and elbow, and down the back of the forearm. Slashes are now seen in most sleeves, and an Italianesque character pervaded the fashion. High soft boots and shoes of a similar shape to the male description were worn, and changed when the square toe shoes came in. Through this period there are many interesting details of costume to study, while gilt tags, finishing laces, and ribbons are to be remarked from this period. Part 2, 15th Century, Male. The chief shapes to mark in this century in male headdress is the increased height of the tall hats which rise to vie with the female fashions. We see still a round hat with a rolled edge and long fall over one side, besides shorter folds in the crown, both scalloped or foliated at the edge, and this shape may be noted till about 1460. Some of these hats were made without a crown, as in Fig. 28. The roll was decorated as a rule with jewelled studs. A top hat, something like our present shape, appears, but more belled to the top, and also a padded rolled brim. It was made in various rich materials, and often decorated with jewels. The peak-fronted hat still continued to be favoured till about 1480, its chief difference being a crown more eccentric in height. Tall cylinder hats, with folded brims or no brims, and other shapes are illustrated. The variety is so great through this period that it is well to study the vagaries of fashion which I have illustrated in sequence as far as possible. They were mostly used till about the last quarter of this century, when the low-crowned flat hat with turned-up brim began to secure the fashion. This was generally worn tilted on one side and often over a scarlet skull-cap. A large bunch of plumes came in with this hat, set up from the front, curving backwards, and giving a very grand effect. With most of the tall hats, the feather was set at the back. A notable change in the tunic, which was worn both very short and to the ground, was the arrangement of folds to the back and front, gathered to a V shape at the waist. The hanging sleeve began to go out of favour after the middle of the century, but the sleeve or cuff covering the hand was continued till the end of this century. A sleeve, full at the shoulder, is found, and short, round, padded sleeves came in, worn over a close-fitting sleeve. This short sleeve became raised on the shoulder, and was cut or looped up the outer side. A very long, loose outer sleeve is also seen in conjunction with these short ones. A very short jacket is notable, of plain square shape, with a plain sleeve on the left arm and a hanging sleeve on the right to the knee. The tight-fitting jerkin, laced on the front, was worn with this as with most other coats. The high collar to the throat had gone out for a collar opened in front. Very short and very long chasubles were worn with or without sleeves, which were gathered high and full at the shoulders. The sleeves were now sometimes slit open at the back, and held with several ties, as linen sleeves are now shown with these. Parti-coloured tights were not so much favoured through this period, but a decorated thigh, or part of the thigh and knee, was a favourite method of enrichment. A long coat came in at the latter part of this time, with a deep V-shaped collar meeting at the waist. It was also cut into a square shape at the shoulders, as in Fig. 43. A loose bell-shaped sleeve usually went with this, often opened in the front of the upper arm. A short square cape is at times seen in conjunction with this. A low square or round neck shape came in during the last quarter of this century, filled in with a fine gathered lawn, and a tight-fitting coat with a pleated skirt, and full padded sleeves, or a tight sleeve with a full puff or spherical upper part. Shoes and boots were still worn with very long pointed toes till about 1465, when a proclamation was issued for beaks or piked shoes not to pass 2 inches, and after this time a broad round-toed shoe began to appear. Soft high boots to the top of the thigh with folded top belonged to this century, as well as the fashionable boot to the calf. The sword or dagger was carried towards the front or side, and a small dagger across the belt at the back. The pouch or purse was also used as a dagger support. End of chapter 4.